First and foremost, I would like to thank David Niosi, because 2 years ago, you came down to speak in Portland to unify us before we even know what to call ourselves. So thank you so much. Even though Fred Edwards is not here today, I would like to take a moment to thank Fred Edwards. Without him and the Coalition of Reason, we would not have put up the 2 billboards that we did. So thank you, Fred Edwards. And he also came up earlier this year to give us a publicity workshop, all funded by the United Coalition of Reason. That amount of generosity cannot go unnoticed. So thank you to those people. I am here to speak on behalf of the Atheist Humanist Society of Connecticut and Rhode Island, an organization which I served 2 terms as the president. When I first joined that group, we had 20 members in our meetup, and Bill Russell, AHS's founder, was more than eager to pass the baton on to me. Even though our group's membership has grown 5-fold because of pub nights and sushi dinners, Dennis, we love you, Dennis. We remain the smallest long-time established group in Connecticut and Rhode Island too, for that matter. I know we don't believe in magic, but what happened during my 2 terms there was nothing short of awe and wonder. Up to that point, I had no experience running a community group, but I was lucky enough to be part of wonderful groups in Dallas, and I wanted more than anything to recreate those sentiments that I felt there here. With no money, and at the time not a lot of people either, but the people we did have are nothing short of amazing. They're passionate, they care so much, and they're the type of people who would give whatever little that they do have to leave our community better than we found it. When I first threw out the idea of CampQuest New England on the table, Jason Stiebel's eyes lit up and took the helm of that project right away and helped launch our camp with our volunteers in 2012. When I said we should do more social outreach, Michelle Maitland backed us up with her United Way contacts. Then Jillian came in and became the liaison to bridge our group with the All Souls UU congregations of New London. Everything was gaining great momentum until Jason's second child came along and he can't take on the responsibility of CampQuest anymore. Our group secretary at the time moved to California, and right when everything seems to fall apart at the same time, Brian Winkler came up to me at last year's holiday party and he said, "Has anyone stepped up as co-chair for CQNE? We had such a great summer last year. I really don't want to see that CampQuest to fall apart." He stepped up and he stepped in. He spent a whole week volunteering at CampQuest Chesapeake in July because they really needed more male volunteers. And on top of which, he wrangled back a bunch of talented staff to volunteer for us next year. Thank you, Brian. Stand up and take a bow. Debbie Smart Pickett, who you just heard speaking earlier, just moved up to this area recently. She jumped in and took on the role as AHS's new secretary. When my second term was coming to an end, I didn't worry about my exit strategy. Boy, did I need one. Because Stephen Pickett was there. Stephen? He is passionate, he is generous, and I consider myself extremely lucky to call him my friend, quirks and all. We may still be the littlest long-time established group due to area population, but that doesn't bother me anymore or make me feel insecure, because you know what? Thanks to amazing members making up AHS, I can run off billions and billions of things this non-believer can believe in. Kindness, friendship, compassion, true generosity, with not even a promise of heaven after death. I want to take this opportunity to also highlight and thank the efforts of Brian Stacks, Pat McCann, Elizabeth Brown, Michael LaRose, Dave Cantor, Jason Gertz, who is still supporting us even out in California, and of course my husband Todd for all of his support and patience. And I apologize that I can't possibly list all of you, but thank you so much. I'm full of optimism in Stephen's talent to take this group and mold and evolve it even further. Bold, generous, passionate, a visionary are words I can use to describe our next speaker. Sikivu Hutchinson is a senior intergroup specialist for the Los Angeles County Human Relations Commission and founder of the Women's Leadership Project, a high school feminist mentoring program. She is the author of Imagining Transit, Race, Gender, and Transportation Politics in Los Angeles, Moral Combat, Black Atheist Gender Politics and Values War, and Godless Americana, Race and Religious Rebels. She is the founder of Black Skeptics Los Angeles and a fellow for the Institute for Humanist Studies. It is with the greatest pleasure for me to present to you the newly honored Secular Woman of the Year by the Secular Woman Organization, Sikivu Hutchinson.
Give us 1 second. Ta-da!
Good afternoon. And now for something completely different. For those of you Monty Python fans out there, I'm one. The deserted shell of a Toyota training center sits on Crenshaw Boulevard, sandwiched in between a funeral home and a strip mall. A stone's throw away on Crenshaw and Rodeo, prayer warriors have descended on a Ralph's supermarket parking lot. The first century, a skinny man in athletic shorts, weaves through the parked cars on Old Schwinn. He flags down the driver of a T-Bird. They exchange quick greetings, then bow their heads and join hands, oblivious for the moment to the crash of street traffic, the manic dance for parking spots, the rustle of grocery bags, and runaway shopping carts. On this hallowed plot of blacktop in South Los Angeles, time is suspended, and God vibrates through the chassis of each parked car as the men bond in the simple bliss of Scripture. In their elite suburban subdivisions, ivory towers, and gentrified redoubts, very few writers in the atheist canon talk seriously about the intersection of economic justice, religion, and place. And this, in my mind, is one of the perks of the white Western condition, the ability to float godlike above it all as the voice of universal experience, untethered by the troublesome realities of communities of color like Los Angeles or New Haven. LA, in the American imagination, has typically been fantasized as either a playground for white starlets like Lindsay Lohan, or a backdrop for nightmarish black ghettoism, a la gangster rap and race riots and drive-bys. And so this has given white middle America the license, the comfort, and the satisfaction in its belief, a la Newt Gingrich, that poor people of color deserve to be poor, and that their hyper-religiosity is part and parcel of bad cultural conditioning. And so I caught up with the parking lot prayer warriors a few weeks before I was scheduled to speak at the Texas Free Thought Convention, and this was a few years ago, the annual convention, which in this particular year was convened in Houston. And the sighting of these parking lot prayer warriors was, to me, emblematic of the unique challenges of black secularism in an age of new Jim Crow mass incarceration and economic inequality. 5 years ago, the scene of two men holding hands in this particular parking lot might have elicited homophobic double takes or a beatdown. But now, the public performance of prayer, as many of you know, street preaching, proselytizing, what have you, has really emerged with a revivalist vengeance born of the vicious arc of the recession. And in South LA, the license plates tell the tale. Blessed for God, Diva for God, God's favorite child, and on and on. In historic Leimert Park, which is a predominantly African-American area, elderly men wave banners that proclaim Jesus loves gangsters too. And so long before Occupy Wall Street's critique of capitalism made it fashionable and sexy for white progressives to lament the demise of the American dream, foreclosure, joblessness, and homelessness were a way of life for many in South LA. At 8.7% of LA County's population, African Americans are 50% of its homeless population and 40% of its prison population. The lines of faith-based food assistance programs swell with newcomers and families. And in this age of endless recession, the prayer warriors have become something of a bellwether of social malaise and economic devastation. And this is particularly true given that communities of color are faced with this intractable paradox of a so-called post-racial, colorblind, exceptionalist meritocracy that has become the largest and most prolific jailer of peoples of African descent on the planet. And so from Tebow on the end zone to the new crop of blinged out reality show pastors, prayer has become an indelible part of public performance and popular culture. And for some people of color, prayer is an important means of establishing sanctuary, solidarity, in-group status, and out-group stigma. In segregated communities of color, prayer, in some regards, has become the last sham gasp of agency and dynamism under a regime of capitalist neoliberalism. And certainly prayer has been mainstreamed globally by the explosion of Pentecostalism. And in the United States, Latino Pentecostals are fast eclipsing the dwindling white evangelical population. But for some Latino communities, Pentecostal organizing and solidarity is a bulwark against a national climate that has become more aggressively and more insidiously anti-undocumented immigrant, xenophobic, racist, and nativist in tenor. And so against this marathon backdrop of devoutness, white nationalism, and xenophobia, all dynamics that we have seen writ large over the past several years since the election of Barack Obama, it was not difficult for me to see 2 years ago why there were not a lot of people of color feeling Texas free thought, because Texas free thought resembled the usual white suspects, Dawkins, Shermer, Hutchinson, and their crew, holding forth in self-congratulatory tones to audiences that resembled and reflected the deep racial divide that defines segregated Americana. And so white privilege means not having to be conscious of the fact that you are never a racial other in any environment, and that secularism, humanism, and free thought mean more than freedom from religion. It means never having to be conscious that the black and brown help at plush conferences outnumber the paying participants of color at said conferences. It means never having to be conscious of the culture of good old Southern white boys backslapping at good old Southern hotels and secular conferences. And so drunk on the Kool-Aid of Western exceptionalism and American meritocracy, there are some atheists that like to believe that secularism and social justice are equivalent and use this misconception to demonize the so-called cultural and political primitivism of so-called third world societies. And so what does it mean in this delusion to subscribe to Western exceptionalism or American meritocracy when white people at every socioeconomic level have 20 times the wealth of blacks and Latinos, and 1 of every 3 African American men is incarcerated or will be incarcerated, young African American men. And so secularism under capitalism, without unlimited access to reproductive health care, living wage jobs, affordable housing, equitable educational opportunities, is a non-starter for women of color who have the highest levels of intimate partner violence, sexual assault, HIV/AIDS, contraction, and mass incarceration and criminalization. And it's interesting and ironic to me as a feminist that in a nation that always proclaims itself to be post-feminist and secularized, more so than the primitive, backward, theocratic, third world societies, that women's liberation is equated with a hypersexuality that is still steeped in this virgin Jezebel dichotomy that is especially insidious for women of color, because women of color have always been constructed as the amoral, hypersexual whores relative to the ideal of white feminine innocence, beauty, morality, humanity, desirability, and respectability. And so in the early 90s, when Madonna exploded onto the scene, the African-American feminist Bell Hooks wrote a forerunning article entitled Madonna, Plantation Mistress or Soul Sister, which I'll read an excerpt from. And it resonated for my budding feminist in the Women's Leadership Project because it applies quite trenchantly to this dynamic of hypersexualization, the way that race is inflected through that dynamic. And so Bell Hooks said, "We have always known that the socially constructed image of innocent white womanhood relies on the continued production of the racist, sexist, sexual myth that black women are not innocent and never can be. Since we are always coded as, quote, fallen women in the racist cultural iconography, we can never be, as can Madonna or Miley Cyrus, publicly working the image of ourselves as innocent female daring to be bad. Mainstream culture always reads the black female body as sign of sexual experience." And so this is a clip of Miley Cyrus at the Video Music Awards about a month ago, and there was a lot of critique and deconstruction of the degree to which she was caricaturing and objectifying black female sexuality and the politics of morality and respectability that inform that with regard to black women's dehumanization. And so stereotyped as black vixens, sexy Latina Jezebels, exotic / spiritual Native American tour guides, or Asian lotus blossom / dragon ladies, women of color have never been able to situate themselves as innocents transgressing to hypersexuality. And this is certainly borne out in the disproportionate criminalization and mass incarceration of African American women in this country. Black women are 3 times more likely than are white women to be tried, convicted, and incarcerated for felony offenses. According to the Center for American Progress, African American women are 1 in 19 times will be incarcerated rather than white women who are 1 in 100 times will be incarcerated. And so African American criminal defendants receive harsher and longer sentences than do white criminal defendants who commit identical crimes. And this is certainly true when we look at mandatory minimum sentences. And of course, there's been a groundswell in this country over the past year as a result of activism forged by communities of color to repeal racist mandatory minimums. And one of the more egregious examples of this is the case of Marissa Alexander, who is an African American woman and a domestic abuse survivor who is currently serving 20 years in a Florida prison for attempting to defend herself against her abusive spouse. And she was recently allowed to have another trial after a groundswell of activism for her case. But by and large, when the criminalization of African American women appears at all within the mainstream lens, it is via the lens of a sympathetic white female protagonist, a la the blockbuster success of the prison drama Orange is the New Black. And so historically, women of color have been ambivalent to secularism, free thought, and humanism precisely because of these legacies of imperialism, white supremacy, apartheid, and patriarchy. And in Godless Americana, I unpack the blind spots of white feminist free thought 19th century discourse and look specifically at the figure of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who regularly trotted out nativist, white supremacist, and xenophobic rhetoric to justify her opposition to the 15th Amendment, which conferred African American men with the right to vote. And so writing about this dynamic in her book, White Women's Rights, and Louise Michelle Newman talks about the degree to which this has informed contemporary women's movement organizing. The feelings of racial superiority that Anglo-Protestants nurtured concerning their own ancestry, heredity, and evolutionary history led them to insist that they shared the white man's inherited capacity for self-government. Indeed, it is not surprising that white female activists had a heightened racial consciousness of themselves as civilized women, contributing to and reinforcing dominant religious, scientific, and cultural ideologies that attributed to them unique moral and political roles on the basis of this identity. Blending religious conviction with science, i.e. social evolutionary theories, and political ideology, i.e. progressivism, white proponents of women's rights helped create new roles for themselves that explicitly maintain the racial hierarchies that were based on the presumption that Anglo-American Protestants were culturally as well as biologically superior to other peoples. So in essence, African American women during this period of racial holocaust did not have the cultural luxury and the privilege to be free thinkers because they were constructed as sexualized, racialized others. Their bodies were the backdrop for European American notions of individual liberty, natural rights, and morality. And their labor was, in essence, the raw material of European intellectualism. And so, given these conditions of extreme racial and sexual terrorism, how could black women be affirmed as persons? Where would they go? The courts, where their rights were not recognized, the Constitution, where their bodies were vessels, the education system, where their culture was demeaned as savage, primitive, and unchristian, government, where their bodies were deep profit for some of the nation's most esteemed legislators and moral philosophers, or white churches, where they were debased as Jezebels and immoral children of Ham. Godliness for ordinary African American women under conditions of sexual and racial terrorism was a medium for articulating artistry, invention, mastery, and control. And in many ways, it remains that way. And so these historical blind spots inform much of contemporary secular coalition building. Because if contemporary secular coalition building remains largely white and middle class and tone deaf to social and economic justice and rigidly fixated on church-state separation, then it too will go the way of the GOP. And so addressing these themes in her article, Next Wave Atheist Leaders and White Privilege, Diane Ariano, who is an atheist, the program coordinator for the Women's Leadership Project, and an undocumented youth advocate, had this to say. Over the past several years, we worked at schools where students who aren't considered gifted or college material aren't encouraged to prepare for college. For example, African American students are disproportionately shut out of college prep, advanced placement, and honors classes. And undocumented students are often told straight up by racist teachers that, quote, my taxes shouldn't pay for you to go to college. Black and Latino students are searched, profiled, and basically considered guilty until proven innocent. Girls of color are ritually silenced when it comes to speaking out about basic rights like freedom from sexual harassment or access to birth control. Most of our students come from highly religious backgrounds that discourage any form of questioning about gender roles. At 16 and 17, girls are already saddled with the double and triple burdens of schoolwork, housework, caregiving, and childcare for younger siblings. Being involved in the WLP, they begin to see the sexism in these double standards and the constant misogynist policing of their sexuality and the racist bitch/hoe/mammy/maid roles that society stereotypes them into. Hardly a week goes by when one of our girls isn't absent because she has to help with childcare or work to support her family. Hardly a quarter goes by when we don't hear a story about a pregnant 10th grader who is keeping her baby because she can't, quote, kill God's creation. For our girls, abortion is freedom and reproductive justice is life, period. So no, trying to get 10 Commandments displays taken down or challenging prayer in school are not our priorities as atheists and free thinkers of color teaching in urban schools. And so Diane's article highlights the intersectional realities that confront communities of color in an age where they are more segregated than during the Brown v. Board desegregation era of the 1950s. And in an age where the most segregated cities are not in the Bubba Bible Belt, but are here in the secular, enlightened North, and young people of color are being pipelined into prisons at egregious rates. And so here are some stats. 40% of students expelled from US schools each year are black. African American students actually comprise a little under 12% of the student body in the United States. And so as a result of this, the Black Skeptics group spearheaded its First in the Family Humanist Scholarship last year. We were the first atheist group in the country to actually attempt to redress prison pipelining with an initiative that is attempting to promote college pipelining amongst our youth because of these egregious disparities. I talked about the disparity in advanced placement, course taking, and enrollment for African American students. That is an actual linchpin for those of you who are college going. It's a linchpin to getting into a 4-year college or university, period. And so these are resources and foundations that do not exist in many quote unquote inner city schools. We spearheaded the First in the Family Humanist Scholarship, specifically recruiting young people in South LA schools that are undocumented, that are in foster care, that are homeless, that are lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and questioning, because these are the youth populations that are the most vulnerable when it comes to prison pipelining. And these are some of our recipients. We also partner with the Women's Leadership Project, with, again, is a feminist humanist mentoring program, emphasis on reproductive justice, emphasis on educating young women to be active, aware, and pushing back against the high rates of intimate partner violence, sexual assault, and HIV/AIDS contraction in communities of color. We also just initiated a Blacks in STEM series. And with all of the fixation on quote unquote science and reason in the free thought atheist and humanist community, there has been no attempt to institutionalize any programming around the gross disparities that exist in the STEM community when it comes to young people of color going through STEM programming, receiving the curricula, and actually going to college in STEM disciplines. So this is an initiative with actually partners talented young STEM professionals in South Los Angeles with first-generation high school students. And so for people of color, this paradox of worshiping what the Harlem Renaissance author Nella Larson termed the white man's God remains. But interviewed by the LA Times days before the election, an elderly African-American woman quipped, quote, "I say I sleep with 3 men, God the Father, God the Son, and Barack Obama." And her faith in this alpha male trinity is perhaps the ultimate challenge to free thought in communities where storefront churches and prayer warriors run deep as a result of the devastation of global capitalism. And it's a veiled lesson to all the humanist / non-believer organizations that are confused about how to approach social justice. To paraphrase the old Civil War political cartoon slogan, diversify, politicize around social justice, or die. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sikivu, Hutchinson, everybody. Thank you. So just a few more announcements before we call up Dennis for the conclusion. Oh, did you want to do question and answer? That's fine. We have time for question and answer. Yeah, let's do it. Okay, so who has some questions then?
Research Center to the American Religious Identification Survey, not a significant amount of people of color would actually describe themselves that way. There has not been a significant growth in the numbers of people of color, that are actively describing themselves as secularist, humanist, or free-thinking, much less atheist. And so a lot of that has to do with the historical trajectory, which I attempted to unpack, in addition to the contemporary reverberations of that with regard to institutional racism and spatial apartheid. They are going to uphold, the right to affirmative action, that they may very well, attempt to strike it down, because of the overwhelming conservatism and, reactionary bent of that court. So I think that would have a devastating impact. We see that there are fewer and fewer young people of color, for example, that go to the University of California system, because they implemented Proposition 209, over a decade ago, and that placed a stranglehold on the numbers of African American and Latino young people that were going to the elite UC campuses in particular. So I think that it will have devastating implications for the enrollment and certainly the retention and graduation of African American and Latino students. That is our bedrock cornerstone issue in exceptionalist Americana. Black and brown women are being locked up left and right at very early ages. It starts at middle school for African American women. African American women are the most suspended and expelled group in the nation, next to young black men. So that's not something that the mainstream white-dominated feminist movement has embraced, much less the atheist movement. So there needs to be a lot more critical consciousness about the kind of capital that progressive, radical humanists of color are bringing to the movement, instead of disavowal and deflection about white supremacist investment in the part of this movement.
That's all we have.
Thank you.
Just a couple quick notes before we call up Dennis. Neil Ayer still has some CDs in the back for sale, so if you'd like to check that out once we're done, that would be wonderful. Directions to Duffy's are going to be on the registration table, so if you need help finding that, we're going to be meeting there at 5:30. You're going to have a little bit of time to socialize until 5 o'clock, and please, again, if you could fill out the surveys and drop them off. Otherwise, I'm sorry. Oh, Neil, actually, Neil, can I call you up just for 1 minute? Neil would like to talk.
Thanks. First of all, I apologize for being a privileged white old male, but on a lighter note, I do have CDs for sale. They're atheist gospel CDs. And what that means is gospel music, because I've been to many black and white gospel churches, but with an atheist message. It's for you to bring back to your home, to listen for enjoyment on your own, but also to build this identity back in your community where you come back to. And I'll just briefly, I also just wanted to thank, imagine this, 7 organizations, 7 speakers, all different ages, genders, race, and the diversity and intelligence of this, it's something I don't get in my little town north of Albany. I really appreciate to be a part of this thing. So thank you to the organizers, and I just wanted to leave you with a few lighthearted thoughts about If you'd like to check out full band gospel vocals, a few of the song titles is all. You don't need God, with a rousing gospel setting. Jesus was a hippie, and some people alluded to that earlier. My imaginary friend, about someone who grew up with an imaginary friend and continues in adulthood with one. Eat the Apple, the Old Testament creation story with kind of a twist for you feminists. God or Santa Claus, and finishing out with, instead of he's got the whole world in his hands, we've got the whole world in our hands. So I'll be back there and you can listen, free lyrics. Welcome you to bring home a piece of this conference with you. Thank you.
I'd like to call up Dennis Himes for final conclusion little talk.
Hello? First of all, let me thank you all for coming. This is the first time we've done anything like this, and we had no idea what kind of response we would get. We were overjoyed with the response that we did get, not only in terms of attendance, but in terms of support from the local organizations and from the people in those organizations. The atheist, secular, free thought, humanist, whatever you want to call it, movement has expanded greatly since I first got involved 11 years ago, both in the Northeast and the country as a whole. In 2002, I attended the Godless Americans March on Washington. We had 2,000 people, and we're happy for that. Last year, I attended the Reason Rally at the same location. We had 20,000 people this time. 10 years from now, we'll probably see that as an indication of how small the movement was then. In 2002, only one of S.A.N.'s sponsoring organizations existed. And there was, as far as I know, only one other free thought group in the state, and that was about to fold. Now free thought organizations seem to be popping up all over. Providing a place for people to meet is no longer a pressing need. Now the need is to get those places working together for our common goals. That was our main goal in running this convention. We wanted to build a community, to establish connections among various organizations throughout the region, and enable the various people involved in the movement in the region to network and establish alliances which will continue for years to come. Establishing the Connecticut Coalition of Reason was a key step in that process, and this convention is the next big step. I have every reason to believe it will not be the last. Does that mean there will be more S.A.N.s? Maybe. We haven't decided yet. One factor which will help us decide will be the exit survey, which you found on your tables and hope you will all fill out. It will help us not only decide if and when to have another convention, but how. Also, I want to remind you again, there will be an after party at Duffy's Tavern at 241 Campbell Avenue, West Haven. You are all welcome to come. The registrations are on the registration table. I'd like to close by thanking the many people who made this possible. A lot of people put in a lot of their free time to make this happen. Adam Aerosmith, who designed the logo and put together the program. Elizabeth Brown, who organized the after party. Dave Canner, who ran registration. Steve Gursky, our videographer. Brandon McNabb, our MC. Pat McCann, who did a whole bunch of stuff. Bob Sank and Steve and Debbie Pickett, who hosted some of the speakers. Richard Siddle, our webmaster. Also, Dan Blinn, Daisy Ching Milano, Carol Padre, Carol Siddle, who all helped in numerous ways. And lastly, I'd like to thank the person was more responsible for this convention's success than any other person. In fact, she may have been more responsible for this convention's success than every other person put together. When I first decided about a year ago to have a convention in the region, one of the very first things I did was to recruit this person. Because I knew she would be very organized, I knew she would have a lot of great ideas, I knew she would put in a lot of work, and I knew she would light a fire under my ass if there's something I needed to get done. And I was right on all counts. In fact, she far exceeded my expectations. She has worked tirelessly in all aspects of this convention over the past year. She has also at the same time made significant contributions to both Connecticut Valley Atheists and the Connecticut Coalition of Reason. Therefore, I would like to not only thank, but to also present the first ever American Atheist Connecticut Activist of the Year Award to Congress Veronica Spirit. That's it.